So yeah, I don't know if you're watching the stream right now. We just went over the amazing Briahna Greyjoy clip. So I know that you were involved in some tweets. So like, what was your involvement like after this was unfolding? Because I saw there was like a lot of drama that you got into with some people on Twitter.
Oh yeah, Bernie or Busters are probably some of the dumbest people on lefty Twitter. Like I ended up quote tweeting it and talking about how it's ridiculous to have this massive issue with just doing the smallest thing you can possibly do to influence political change in your country, which is vote, and trying to take this weird like, oh, I'm not going to do it because they're both the same, or oh, certain people will suffer the same amount they do now under Biden as they do Trump, so why should I vote? None of these arguments are valid whatsoever, and I pointed that out on Twitter, but Bernie or Bust Twitter is very angry.
Yeah, I knew this tweet was going to be a fucking problem. So, Briahna Greyjoy, the former National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders, she did an interview with Noam Chomsky on her podcast, and what she was pushing was the whole Bernie or Bust thing, which is fucking idiotic. But what she did in her tweet to promote this podcast was basically throw up the hashtag ADOS. And I knew this was going to be a fucking problem because I knew there was a bunch of fucking white leftists so fucking smug, think they know every fucking thing, but don't know shit about black politics, who are going to come in and not learn anything, but fill in the gaps of their fucking knowledge with their own fucking imagination. And that's exactly what has happened over and over and over again since this bullshit podcast and fucking tweet. Now, in reality, ADOS has been at odds with not only Briahna Greyjoy, but the whole Bernie Sanders campaign. We see Briahna Greyjoy as an albatross around the neck of black politics. And she is an albatross that was put on our necks by white leftists. Because Briahna Greyjoy's class reductionist positions make white leftists feel comfortable. Now, we've had to fight this bullshit while simultaneously trying to push the Sanders campaign further left on the issue of reparations. His campaign rejected us, and we rejected him. What she's trying to do with this fucking tweet is manipulate ADOS to be the fucking attack dogs for this Bernie or Bust shit. Because she knows we were kicking their ass that whole fucking campaign. So she thinks if she takes some of our talking points and throw up the hashtag, that we would take the fucking bait. But you see, there's a tiny problem with that. We're not coming to save you, Briahna. We don't give a fuck about Bernie Sanders. But now, because of you, we got a bunch of clueless leftists that see you as the only gateway to black America. So what they're going to do is take your beliefs and transpose it onto all of us.
Frustrating.
Yeah, no, I get it. Now, actually, interesting pivot, because when I was doing research and when I had some people in my Discord like doing some digging about this, some people found like specifically, so if we're talking about like Briahna Greyjoy and like why, like some of her motivations for why she said some of this. Let me ask you this. Have you heard of a group called ADOS, or the American Descendants of Slavery? Does that ring any bells for you?
No.
Okay. So this is a small it connects back to some stuff that we were talking about earlier, right? But actually, some people drew like what started driving some information towards me. All right. Now this is just what I've been able to gather, but like a while ago, Briahna Greyjoy posted a tweet, right? And it's basically like to the same flavor that we've been talking about, right? She said this: I asked a simple question: what can Black Americans do to get our voices heard? How does political capture hurt my community's material circumstances? What can we expect? When can we expect equality? And the left melted down. That you don't have an answer should bother you. At Bad Faith Pod, hashtag ADOS, right? So essentially, it's literally the same, like, oh, the left doesn't actually have any solutions to racism, even though it does, question mark?
You think the left has solutions to racism? Where are these fucking solutions? Why didn't Bernie Sanders run on them? Like, what fucking policy does the left have that's going to solve the racial wealth gap? The only reason why Briahna Greyjoy has a position in politics is specifically because she wasn't going to talk about race. She was elevated because she was a young black face that would rather talk about class instead of race. That's why the Bernie Sanders campaign loved her. The only thing that the left was offering in regards to race during this whole Bernie Sanders campaign was some picture from the 1960s and a few tokens. During this election cycle, the thing that became most obvious to us is that black people who descend from American chattel slavery don't actually have any fucking allies in any corner of this political arena.
I don't know. It's just kind of like a straw man, but also kind of like this vague Bernie or bust. Like, it's Bernie or bust, but also like with a very particular kind of like lens of race. And so I ended up asking.
Oh my fucking God. We're not for a fucking candidate. We're for fucking reparations. So no, we're not fucking Bernie or busters. What the fuck was Bernie doing about race?
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Part of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the U.S. is the legacy of income inequality in the U.S. What is your position on reparations to the descendants of slaves?
Well, as I just indicated, there are massive disparities that must be addressed. There is legislation that I like, introduced by Congressman Jim Clyburn. It's called the 10-20-30 legislation, which focuses federal resources in a very significant way on distressed communities. Communities that have high levels of poverty. It is not acceptable to me that the rate of childhood poverty among the African American community is over 30% in this country. That is beyond belief. That African Americans die from cancer at higher rates than whites. So we're going to do everything we can to put resources into distressed communities and improve lives for those people who have been hurt from the legacy of slavery.
So what is your position specifically on reparations? I asked the question because Elizabeth Warren, Julian Castro, they've indicated they want to support.
What does that mean? What do they mean? I'm not sure that anyone's very clear. What I've just said is that I think we must do everything that we can to address the massive level of disparity that exists in this country.
I'll tell you what they mean, because Elizabeth Warren has said black families have had a much steeper hill to climb. We need systematic structural changes to address that. Julian Castro has said, I have long thought that this country would be better off if we did find a way to do that. Reparations.
Well, I agree with what Elizabeth said.
So you would support reparations?
But read what she said. What does that mean? She means, I think, I don't want to put words into her mouth, is what I said.
A little bit more, and essentially it seems like ADOS, as a group, focuses in here. I have like a whole organization called Why ADOS is Trash, Receipts Attached, but I'll summarize here, right?
Here we go. The diligent research. And this Riley Grace is a law student. And what she pulls up is the Medium article written by the washed up rapper Talib Kweli. Like, nothing from actual journalists, nothing that would actually give like an objective opinion or presentation of this group. we start off with an article that lists them as trash. And this is supposed to, I guess, be an unbiased look into a new political movement. Anyways, it's also interesting that none of these people that gravitate to this Medium article never look into Talib Kweli to see what he's doing these days. And one of his victims just happens to be a co-founder of ADOS.
Essentially, it's kind of like an organization, a group, whatever you want to call it, that's focused on the idea that, like, because America has so disparagingly harmed people of color, that there is literally no saving, or, like, there's no way to be able to, through, like, standard or electoral means, be able to, like, adequately, kind of like repair the harm that's been done to the black community, right?
People of color, the black community, people of color, the black community.
Oh, here they go, using people of color and black like it's interchangeable, when in reality they specifically mean black. But we'll get into that later. So our position is that the Democrat Party is taking advantage of black people. They aren't actually doing anything to justify our support. Now, if we're going to be completely honest,
distressed communities.
There isn't a political faction
Distressed communities.
Within the Democrat Party
Poverty.
Or the broader left
Poverty.
That is offering some type of solution that is sufficient enough to remedy the harm that has been done by slavery, black code laws, peonage, convict leasing, exclusion from the Homestead Act, exclusion from FHA subsidies, exclusion from the GI Bill, racial covenants, segregation, redlining, mass incarceration. I can actually go on and list more things. But this is why leftists seem so fucking silly when they talk like they have some actual solutions. What is student loan forgiveness? Is that going to solve something for us? It's all a fucking joke.
Ultimately, we can avoid all of this, and I'd love to avoid all of this, if we just put more effort into addressing the underlying racial disparities in this country. But nobody wants to do that.
Which would be what
real anti-redlining policies and reparations, not on race, it gets messy, but on class.
Not on race, it gets messy, but on class.
Because if you were poor 100 years ago and white, you had it better than if you're poor 100 years ago in black, for sure. But there are still issues you can fix across the board.
100 years ago, the American government was still denying former slaves 40 acres and a mule. But it did have the Homestead Act in effect, which largely excluded black people who descend from American chattel slavery. What's interesting about this conversation is that these two people are supposed to be from two opposite sides of the political spectrum, and yet they are so easily in agreement with leaving the racial hierarchy as is. In their minds, black people should not exceed the very bottom of white society. Even though the reason why reparations are to be paid is because of injuries that we received from the American government that these other groups of poor people have not received.
And that way you don't get a lot of really messy racial politics that might otherwise have felt like, what do? Like you test people's blood.
A goal that is associated with the redress component of reparations is to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And this would be done primarily through direct payments to eligible recipients, Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. In the book, we identify two standards for eligibility. The first criteria is what we refer to as a lineage criteria. An eligible individual would have to demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And the second criterion is what we refer to as an identity criterion. And this is a criterion that says that an individual would have to show that for at least 12 years, before the onset of a reparations program, the enactment of a reparations program, or the enactment of a study commission for a reparations program, whichever comes first, for at least 12 years before that, an individual would have to have shown that they self-identified as Black, Negro, or African American.
Like, what do? Like, you test people's blood, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
I agree with that for sure.
Yeah, that gets really, really messy. But nobody wants to do this. I mean, Republicans, Democrats, neither of them want to do this.
But nobody wants to do this. Democrats, neither of them want to do this.
I know, and this is contended in a lot of conservative circles, but I think an economist recently estimated that the damage done to the Black community in this country could be monetarily represented by a figure of like 14 trillion. And that's one estimate, of course.
But it's just political. I mean, how do you actually estimate
well,
this
of course, you know, there are different methods and methodologies. I'm not an economist. I can't fact check him. I know there are lower estimates as well. But we know this, you know. In the United States of America, for the longest time, the western reaches of this country, they didn't have roads, and they didn't have electricity, and they didn't have phone lines. And through an enormous expenditure of federal wealth, we put effort into bringing that infrastructure westward, because the investment brings about more educated people, encourages the development of more land, which allows for more people to live there, which means more money. And we're facing now the same issue, albeit in a much more sophisticated way, with a lot of poor communities in this country, a lot of which are Black or Latino, where we now know these communities are black holes of wealth. People will make fun of this. Like, why give money to the schools? It's a black hole. We could invest. We could prevent that from being a problem.
But there are more poor white people than poor Black people.
Sure, and we should invest, absolutely. But there are specific elements of
Black poverty.
To be fair, I think you already said
reparations on class,
not race anyway.
Yeah,
I get it.
There are.
And there's a disproportion of people of one race who might be wealthier or
he's being held hostage by Tim in his basement.
If you enact racial policy, you leave people poor and you don't actually solve the problem of poverty. So is our goal to just say we want to help one race, ignoring all the others, or do we want to end poverty? In which case, these programs should be ended and our policies should be based on class and not race, so long as we've gotten rid of racism in our laws.
Sure, the racial, of course. Well, there are racial disparities that'll need to be addressed as well. If you have Black folk on average in a certain place and white folk on average in a better place, lifting people out of poverty won't fix the respective divide between Black and white people. It'll just level the pot in general.
If you have Black folk on average in a certain place and white folk on average in a better place, lifting people out of poverty won't fix the respective divide between Black and white people. It'll just level the pot in general.
So here we have a white leftist socialist explaining to this guy who is a cheerleader for the alt-right how the left plans to screw the American descendants of slavery out of reparations. The alt-right motherfucker is receptive to this idea because he understands that this will not change the racial hierarchy in America. The white leftist admits the con game of using the term reparations to screw Black people, and they find common ground on the idea of Black people remaining at the bottom of this society. And you still believe these are your fucking allies?
By 1968, you can't say nigga, that hurts you, backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is Blacks get hurt worse than whites.
My actual first ever engagement with Briahna Greyjoy, Theon Greyjoy here, was when she saw some statistics that said that older people of color overwhelmingly support Biden, like overwhelmingly, and she ended up deleting this tweet because it was so bad. She ended up tweeting, "Old Black people are not people of color. They don't represent us," or something along those lines. So the meme at the time was everyone...
Hold on. Do you guys remember when this fucking bitch, when she said she was encountered with the data that people of color overwhelmingly supported Biden during the primaries, which is true. Now, there were old Black people that supported Biden. That was the majority of these people of color. And Briahna Joy got so mad about this, she said... It was very badly worded, but it's such a good meme. It's such a fantastic meme. Old Black people aren't
people of color.
This was Briahna Greyjoy trying to co-opt the rhetoric of ADOS in regards to the doublespeak that we hear from leftists in regards to the term people of color. People of color is a vague term that is supposed to stand for non-white people. What often happens is that it's used as a politically correct way of saying black people. But a lot of black people are taking offense to this now because we have noticed the game that has been played with this people of color term and terms like minority and so on and so forth. You use these terms in front of us in a way to where it implies that you're talking about black people. Then when it's time to write policy, you use the term people of color as a way to avoid doing something specifically for black people, or as a way to undermine any policy that was supposed to be specifically for black people. So instead of getting policy that is specifically made to remedy our situation, we get this policy that is non-specific and is used to help a bunch of different other groups who haven't experienced exactly what we have gone through. And ultimately, what this does is dilute any benefits that would improve the social economic standings of ADOS people.
The generic Bernie or bust argument, oh, well, Biden was racist when he implemented a policy back in, what was it, the 60s? It was the crime bill
that was overwhelmingly supported by almost every single politician, left and right.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the most unanimous decisions among both parties ever passed into law. Like it was unheard of for
Mm-hmm.
both parties to agree so much on a bill. And there were actually some parts of that bill that were okay, but also a lot that wasn't because it was the 60s. But yeah, it's
very, very dumb.
All right, so I think they're referring to the 94 crime bill. I have no clue why they're talking about the 60s, but generally when people talk about this, they're talking about the 94 crime bill. On face value, this argument is already ridiculous. The idea that a law can't be racist because our politicians are in agreement to do it, like, I don't know if you know much about American history, but that has been a consistent theme where basically all the factions within our politics have come together to fuck over black people with discriminatory laws. So, like, already that's dead in the water. But let's get into this whole idea about Joe Biden being racist because of these crime bills. Now, first off, the 94 crime bill is not even the beginning of this. Joe Biden has a long history of using the legal system to fuck over black people. Ronald Reagan thought Biden was too far to the right in this regard. Now, from Biden, what we get is the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. Then the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. Then the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. And the cherry on the top is the 1994 crime bill. Now, it would be a little bit unfair to describe Joe Biden as the sole architect of mass incarceration. So let's take a look at one of his partners in crime.
There's not enough troops in the army to force their southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our...
Strom Thurmond is remembered today as one of the great American hypocrites. He was the firebrand segregationist who had a black daughter. This was the revelation that came out after his death. We also know Thurmond as the Dixiecrat candidate in 48, the author of the Southern Manifesto in 56, and the record holder, even to this day, of the longest filibuster, 24 hours and 18 minutes, that he spoke against the 1957 Civil Rights Act. We know Thurman is one of the last of the Jim Crow demagogues.
I came to the United States Senate, a 29-year-old fella, out of the civil rights movement, a public defender, and turns out one of my closest friends ends up being Strom Thurmond, a man whose background and interest at that time when I came were considerably different than mine. If you had told me when I entered the United States Senate that one of the people that I would have the closest relationship with in the Senate would be Strom Thurmond, I'd have told you you were crazy. Because as Strom told me, he said, Joe, if there has to be a Democrat as president, and I hope it won't happen, he said, it might as well be you. And after I dropped out of the race, he came to me and said, don't worry about it. He said, you got a good 30 years left to try.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. The Democratic chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the Democratic President of the United States of America, the Democratic Attorney General, the Republican leader of this effort, Senator Hatch, the Republican senator from Texas, we all agree on that. Now, we can find some fringe folks in the study groups on the right wing and left wing, libertarians and left-wingers in my party who say, no, that's not what we should do. But politically, that consensus has been arrived at. I acknowledge there was not that consensus in the 60s. There is today. There's a second thing that we all have agreed upon, and that is unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now, not out of a liberal instinct for love, brother, and humanity, although I think that's a good instinct, but for simple, pragmatic reasons. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now.
If we weren't in the middle of an election, most of these leftists would admit that the outcomes of mass incarceration are racist. And in that clip we just saw, Joe Biden was essentially suggesting that these outcomes were what he intended all along. He was trying to lock up black people indiscriminately and throw away the key. Now, there's another excuse that's given out here, basically that black politicians supported the crime bill. The problem that most black people have with this type of statement is that black politicians are bought and paid for by people outside of their communities. Their communities generally don't have the type of money to finance a political campaign. So these black politicians don't feel obligated to represent our interests, and they don't. But if I were to give them an out, because they do actually have an out in this situation, during that time period, they were presenting an alternative bill, an alternative crime bill that focused mainly on prevention and alternatives to incarceration. That's what they thought they were going to get in exchange for support. The Democratic leaders sold out black people and then coerced a lot of these black politicians to fall in line. Now, this last piece illustrates the problem with using terminology like people of color when you specifically mean black. There's this talking point to defend the 94 crime bill, and it's based on a Gallup poll that I can't find the original, but when I look at the reporting, we get conflicting messages. Some reporting suggests that 58% of black people supported the 94 crime bill. And then we have other reporting that suggests 58% of non-whites supported the 94 crime bill. Well, obviously, 58% isn't some great majority. And if you're including other minority groups in that 58%, then it's very likely that the majority of black people did not support the 94 crime bill. And this little mix-up in terminology can drastically change the perspective around what we're talking about. And this is why we're focusing on specificity. We want things to be very, very clear. We don't want to hear any vague terms like people of color, like minority, like underprivileged communities. None of this bullshit. But I want to be perfectly clear. Even if that 58% were black, even if we were able to confirm that all of those black politicians had the same motivation of just blind support for the 94 crime bill, black people can knowingly and unknowingly be tools of white supremacy. This is something that lefties can understand when they're talking about black conservatives or black Republicans. They throw this out all the time. But when you're talking about someone on their team, they pretend like they don't understand this concept anymore. So none of these are valid excuses to, I guess, take away any claim of racism in regards to the 94 crime bill or in regards to Joe Biden. But to finish this video up, I think we need to go back to the end of their discussion about ADOS.
It's essentially just like a rejection of like the idea, like it's a pure rejection of the idea of like harm reduction. So like voting for Biden, it's a pure, like it's essentially like everything that we've been talking about distilled down into like a movement centered around the idea that like, oh, well, white leftists have failed us, so we might as well just say, fuck the system, we're doing our own thing. And if you try to talk over us, well, you ain't black, so you have nothing to say.
I think the most frustrating part for black people is that there's some expectation that we have to entertain your ignorance and calmly wade through your arrogant delusions to try to make you understand basic motherfucking things that you should be able to figure out on your own. Maybe what's getting lost in the translation when white people describe these interactions is that we don't want to waste our time and energy fighting through your delusions of grandeur, trying to get you to understand basic reality because you can't see past your own experience. So ultimately, what we tend to do is dismiss your opinion, not just because you're white, but because you don't know what the fuck you're talking about.